Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. This is our Neuroscience and Education webinar series, and we're going to be talking about cognitive skills training for students with learning disabilities. I am Betsy Hill, and President and Chief Operating Officer of the Brainware Company. A few housekeeping matters as we get started. Everybody is in listen mode today. Although we have a small group, and I know some of you already, so we might even consider opening it up for questions at the end, but we'll see how things go up until then. Along the way, though, we do encourage you to enter any questions into the chat window, and we'll check them periodically and then also at the end. We are going to be sharing the slides from this presentation. If you are attending today, and you provided your contact information when you logged in, you will automatically get a copy of it. If you happen to be participating via a phone, you're using the app on your phone, then the email address don't always get connected with your name. So if you would make sure that you can just type that into the chat window as well. We also are happy to provide a certificate of participation for those today who wish to have it for continuing professional development credit, and just type certificate or something to that effect in the chat window, and we will take care of that for you. If you are listening to this as a recorded, we are recording this today, and if you are listening to the recorded version, then you can simply email us at bhill@mybrainware.com, and I'm going to type that into the chat window, and we will also share it with you later. It's on a slide towards the end, but feel free to, if you are watching this later and would like to get the materials that we'll be distributing as well as a certificate or a certificate, you can just let us know that way. I think that's it for housekeeping, so let's just go ahead and get started. Here's our plan for the next hour or so. We're going to explore cognitive skills and the role they play in learning to read, learning math, academic performance in general. Then we'll talk about how they can be trained. And once we have those principles of good cognitive skill training in mind, we're going to take a look at some research with a program that embodies all of those criteria, those principles, called Brainware Safari, and we'll look at the kind of impact that it can have on student performance, both cognitively and academically. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about some things to keep in mind when cognitive skills training is being incorporated in an IEP. So as we get started, I know that a couple of you have already found the poll, but they're up in the area where the chat window is. If you look at where the chat link is and go over to your right just a little bit, there's a poll. And if you would be so kind as to let me know a little bit about who we have in the webinar this afternoon, that would be great. So I see a couple people have responded already. And hopefully everybody can see where that is. I'll give you another few seconds to find the poll and let us know a little bit about who you are and where you're coming from. So it looks so far as if we're pretty evenly divided between teaching students with learning disabilities and clinicians who work with them. And also we have a parent advocate. So that is great to hear. Great, thank you all so much. That gives me a little bit of an idea and is helpful as I try to provide the most helpful information and explain things in a way that will make sense to you as we go along. So the first thing we want to do is look at a model of cognitive processing that we have been using and refining over a number of years now. Obviously, this is not a picture of a brain or a brain scan. It is really more of a conceptual model about how all these processes sort of fit together. So we start, of course, with input from the outside world, where information comes in through our senses and undergoes some initial processing, throwing out most of the information that we're exposed to because it's simply too much for our the bandwidth that we have in our brain. So we get rid of a lot of it. And we do that with and move things along to the next stage with skills like our attention skills, our visual span, which determines how much information we can take in at a glance, our ocular motor control, how we coordinate gathering information through our eyes, our ears, we do sort of the same thing. And all of this is supported by some of our very short-term sensory memory processes, so that all of these cognitive skills we're going to be talking about incorporate and connect to our various memory skills. We can call this area reception. The second area we can call perception. This is when we start to give meaning to the information. So we identify objects, we make connections among things that are related. Here, visual and auditory discrimination are important, as are visual-spatial skills like directionality. And also, we have to integrate different aspects of sensory information, like visual and auditory information. And of course, the ability to identify the input that we're getting means that we have to compare it to what is in our memory. So we have to have that connection working very well there as well. Most of the information up to this point is non-conscious and happens for the most part in thousandths of a second, faster than we even know it's happening. But sometimes it doesn't happen as accurately and efficiently as we would like, and then, of course, we're going to start to get into the realm of learning deficits and cognitive issues. After we perceive the information, then we can start to actually do something with it, and then we start to use the directive capacities of our mind, which are often now referred to as executive functions. That's a term I find that many teachers and educators are becoming familiar with, which is great because they are vitally important, as we will see, when it comes to reading and math and pretty much everything we do in our lives. The last step that we're showing here is what we can call thinking. Here again, this is where our thinking becomes very conscious. We make decisions, we make plans, we reason, we create things, and there's some kind of output. These can also be referred to as executive functions, but maybe higher order executive functions, but sometimes people refer to them that way as well. And of course, all of this is connected to our memory skills. We can't do much without that, from short-term sensory memory to working memory to the various types of long-term memory. This is a different way of looking at those cognitive skills and relating them, at least conceptually, to reading and to math. And what we can think of is a sort of pyramid of a foundation for learning. So down at the very bottom are cognitive skills that we call foundational. These are the ways that we get information in from the outside world. We talked about a few of them. This is a longer list here that we looked at on the previous slide, but they happen again in fractions of a second in a very non-conscious, hopefully automatic way. But that's where the information gets into our brains to actually start the learning process. The next here represents the set of cognitive skills, again, that we call executive functions. These are highly correlated with academic performance, and the three core executive functions are working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. Working memory refers to our ability to hold information in our mind while we think about it or manipulate it. Inhibitory control is pretty much what it sounds like. It's our ability to stop ourselves from doing something that we would otherwise do. But it also can be over a period of time. So our ability to defer gratification is not just an instantaneous one time I do something, but where we are able to defer our things that we would like to do in favor of things that we believe are going to help us achieve our goals. And then lastly, cognitive flexibility reflects our ability to adjust our thinking when the world around us changes. So we all have mental models of how the world works, or how people are supposed to behave, or how processes happen in physics and all those kinds of things. And when we learn something new that fundamentally changes that, then we have to adjust a whole bunch of other things. And our ability to adapt to that is what is referred to as cognitive flexibility. And then, of course, we mentioned before higher order executive functions, and this is where we want all of our students to be functioning. That's the goal, that's the ideal. And what we're showing here is that all of this sits underneath reading and math. They're not somehow on the side. They're not something that we learn in addition to or on top of or after we learn to read or learn to do math, because in fact these are integral parts of the ability to learn to read and to do math. And the last point to make here is that when we talk about learning disabilities, we're talking about issues with processes within this pyramid of infrastructure skills that don't function as efficiently or as accurately or as easily as they need to be for learning to read and learning to math to be really successful. So what we're going to do next is we're going to dig a little bit deeper into reading and then math and look at some examples. I always think it's very helpful not just to mention cognitive skills, but to try to give everybody an idea of what they really mean and how they might impact our ability to do academic work and other kinds of things. So if you were to ask most teachers what the basics of reading are, typically you will hear something like decoding and fluency and comprehension. And indeed, those are important skills. We can't be good readers unless we can do all of those things. But they're also not the most basic. There is, in fact, no decoding part of our brain. In order to decode, we have to have a bunch of different things working at the same time. Sustained attention, for example, if I can't do that, decoding is going to go off track pretty quickly. Visual discrimination, quickly determining the difference between a B and a P or an M and an N. Sequential process, a little bit more in a minute. And how much information we can take in a glance, our flexible attention and processing speed. And then when it comes to comprehension, here is attention because it's sort of a summary for a whole bunch of things that are going on, but really without working memory, without visualization, some of those kinds of skills. Tara has asked a great question that I will answer along the way. She asked, how much does maturity play a role in students' abilities? And in general, all of these skills that we're talking about develop as we get older. They get stronger. Some of the basic, really foundational cognitive skills tend to develop earlier. For example, our vision system and our auditory system, which are critical to survival, tend to develop earlier than others. We know now that the parts of our brain that are responsible for our executive functions, which is the prefrontal cortex, the part right behind your forehead, doesn't really completely mature until we are in our mid-20s or possibly even 30. So yes, these do develop over time, but the fact of the matter is everybody has cognitive strengths and weaknesses, areas where we're better or not as strong, and they don't develop in lockstep. A lot of it, like everything with our brains, happens when we interact with our environment. And so to the extent that our interaction with the environment has encouraged and supported the development of these skills, will tend to be stronger. So it's definitely a combination. A little bit more concrete. And the first one we're going to look at, unintended, is called visual span, which refers to how much information we can take in at a glance. This is a little tricky to do over the internet, but it worked well this morning, and we're going to try it again. So what's going to happen here is that you are going to see an array of 6 boxes, and letters are going to appear in those boxes very briefly. You just have a very short time to see if you can figure out which of the boxes is different. So 5 of them are going to be the same, 1 is going to be different. You don't need to write this down, but this is the audience play along participation part. So hopefully you'll be able to see which one is different. And this has to do with visual span. So here we go. Okay. So were you able to see which one was different? If you picked the bottom middle box, you were correct. But why do we care? Why do we care about this? So one of the reasons that we care, or main reason that we care, is that we really have 2 types of vision. We have center vision and we have peripheral vision. The center vision, of course, is in the very center, where we have the greatest, clearest, most specific focus. As we get out further in our peripheral vision, our vision is not as clear. We don't get quite as much information, but it's very, very important. We read a word with our center vision, but we detect little differences non-consciously with our peripheral vision. So being able to take in more information, having a bigger span of what we can take in and derive meaning from, is going to be really important for building up fluency in reading, for example, and as well as other things like if you think about standing on a soccer field or football field, if you are outside of the U.S., which I think we do have at least one person where you would be calling it football, and trying to figure out where the ball is, or think about driving. We use that example, and how much better a driver you're going to be if your peripheral vision is working together with your center vision. All right, another example, we talked about comprehension and the importance of visualization and working memory. And this often brings to mind for me one of my very favorite books from my childhood days called Mary Poppins. Many of you may be familiar with it. And it starts this way. If you want to find Cherry Tree Lane, all you have to do is ask the policeman at the crossroads. He will push his helmet slightly to one side, scratch his head thoughtfully, and then we will point his huge white gloved finger and say, first to your right, second to your left, sharp right again, and you're there. Good morning. So, do you have in your mind an image of how to get to Cherry Tree Lane? Have you ever been in a situation where someone gave you a set of directions and you had to keep them in mind while you navigated your way there? So your ability to visualize this scene, to hold the directions in your mind, later deciding whether to turn right or left at that first cross street, is dependent on your ability to visualize, and it's dependent on the capacity of your working memory. So we want those things to be working really well, and that's really what we mean when we talk about comprehension. The same principles apply in math. Here are some important math skills, starting with visual-spatial processing. So students who have problems with spatial memory or visualization or directionality are also probably going to have difficulty with things like extracting information from a chart or a graph, or manipulating geometric shapes, and those kinds of things. Math requires us also to do quite a lot of information manipulation, from something as simple as counting and keeping track of where we are, what things we've counted and what things we haven't, to teasing out and being able to remember and understand the relationships among the elements of a story problem. And today, of course, I'm dating myself by calling it a story problem or a word problem, but we used to think about those things a little bit differently. But today, everything is supposed to be a story problem. Everything is supposed to be about its application in the real world. And so we're getting much, even more of that than we ever have in the past. And ultimately, math is very logical, so our ability to reason, our ability to plan how we're going to think through a problem and attack it are really important. And of course, many of these skills are also used in reading, as we saw before. One skill that I want to spend a little time on because it has a very significant application in math is called directionality, which is our ability to know left from right, but also to be able to project that onto other objects in space. So this is an example of a set of geometry concepts and emphasize how important it is. So it's essential, actually, in our ability to distinguish different types of transformation. So rotating an object, either clockwise right or counterclockwise left, can yield a very different result. And both of those are different from a reflection, which is just a mirror image of something, or a translation, which is moving the same object but oriented the same way, but just moving it a little bit in space. So let's take a specific geometry problem. Just kidding, we're not going to do that one. But in fact, we would have to use our rotation skills and our directionality skills to be able to solve it. But we'll do a little bit simpler one that I think we can probably tackle here as a group. And again, you don't have to type your answer in, although you can certainly do that if you would like to. But it's really just to practice our rotation skills and think about them. So one of the images, there's an image on the left, that little L sort of lying on its back. And one of the images at the right represents a 90-degree counterclockwise rotation of the shape on the left. So if you said A, you were right. If you said B, that was a 90-degree rotation, but it would be a 90-degree rotation clockwise, not counterclockwise. And C represents a 180-degree rotation. And of course, with a 180-degree rotation, we don't care whether it's right or left because it ends up in the same spot. But sort of making the point that hopefully that our ability to do that is really dependent on our understanding of directionality and the sort of mental maps that we have to be able to do that. Now, I know a lot of people, and in fact I have a colleague who, if she's here listening to me right now, is probably rolling her eyes because she calls herself, she's math phobic, a little bit math challenged. And perhaps you have some students who are. There's certainly many kids who say, oh, this is hard, I can't do math, I don't see things that way, and I don't really need this anyway. So you can share with your students that, in fact, just about every video game that they play or would like to help develop when they get older involves a rotation. So you can see the blue car rotating here as it is exploding in midair or whatever it's doing. And so this is, part of our daily life, part of the kinds of things that students will certainly want to be involved with and do. We could also think about whether, when we're following a GPS system or a map of some kind, whether the next turn is right or left, and can we figure that out in enough time to make the right turn without rotating the map. So, for example, the GPS system in my car, I can't actually pick it up and turn it around as I would a paper map, but I still have to figure out whether the next turn is right or left. And while it sometimes tells me, it doesn't always tell me in the time frame that I would like it to and give me enough advance notice. So thinking about that ahead is really helpful. All right, so going back to our pyramid of skills, hopefully we've given a little more insight into how essential these cognitive processes are, how closely intertwined they are in the processes of reading and math. It's also, I think, helpful to reflect for a moment on the fact that as teachers, we get asked to teach reading, we get asked to teach math, and all the stuff that relies on that without knowing for sure that this cognitive infrastructure, all these cognitive skills are working the way that we would like them to be working. And even when we suspect that they're not, then we have to puzzle about that as well as they need to. Of course, that's where special education comes into the picture. So the formal process sometimes it's a little different in different types of an environment, but recognize that students who have learning disabilities have deficits in these underlying cognitive processes that get in their way of academics. And a number of different kinds of strategies have been adopted over time. These strategies tend to fall in 3 areas. The first is modification of the curriculum. So here we do things like provide additional instruction, we teach and reteach, or we break it down into smaller components, or sometimes we teach less. We might provide text at a lower grade level of reading, or require fewer spelling words, or those kinds of things. So those are all sort of modifications of the curriculum. Another thing we do is provide accommodation to support students. So we might, for example, give them additional time on a test or on an assignment. We might break it down and have them do pieces of it where we are the finished product on a given schedule. We might provide assistance for note-taking, either an aid or sometimes a technology tool of some kind, or reading instructions to them as opposed to requiring them to read them. And then the third category is compensatory strategies. The truth of the matter is that learning strategies are useful for everybody. We all have cognitive strengths and weaknesses. We all figure out ways, or are taught ways, to work around our areas where we're not as strong. Students with learning disabilities really benefit from explicit instruction on strategies, ways to be organized, ways to attack problems, ways to group things, how to use mnemonics and other kinds of memory devices and things like that. So we can all benefit from these, but they're particularly important for students with learning disabilities, of course. So one of the things that's important to understand about these strategies is that their purpose is to bypass the cognitive processes that are weak in order to minimize the impact of those deficits on learning. So if a student has poor working memory and can't remember a set of instructions, I will eliminate the need for them to remember that list of things. Instead of saying, Johnny, take out your pencil, open the test booklet, and write your name at the top, I will say, Johnny, take your pencil out, and then I will wait for Johnny to get his pencil out. And then I will say, now open your test booklet, and I will wait for him to do that. So I'll give the instructions separately. So the question we're going to be talking about now is if there isn't another approach, if there isn't a way that we can actually target those underlying processes and help our students develop them to the point that they can use them instead of simply bypassing them and compensating for them in other ways. And the quick answer is yes. It is possible through cognitive skills training in the right kind of way to build the underlying cognitive infrastructure. And so now we're going to talk about what's involved with that. So cognitive skills training has actually been around for several decades now in a clinical setting. And as well, there are some computer-based tools that provide cognitive skills training. You'll hear a lot about brain training in the news, and whether it works or whether it doesn't work, a lot of discussion around that. But based on those decades of experience in the clinical setting and based on the research that we are familiar with, these are what we believe to be the keys to effective cognitive skills training. And we'll take them one by one here. So the first thing is that the cognitive skills training that goes on has to be of sufficient frequency and duration. Just like physical exercise, if I go to the gym one day a week, I might feel a little less guilty, but I'm really not doing much for my strength, for my flexibility, for my endurance, all that kind of thing. But if I go 3 to 5 times a week, I'm going to really start to notice some differences. It's really going to have an impact. The change usually starts to become pretty apparent after 6 or 7 weeks. So there are a few weeks at the beginning there where you're not seeing the change, even though our brains are working on those new skills and trying to accomplish them. But starting at that point, we're going to start to see some change. And usually we can, if we're going to keep up on that schedule, we're going to be seeing some really dramatic change after about 10 to 12 weeks. And Tara, we'll talk about 3 to 5 times a week. It can be during the school day. It can be before school or after school. It could be include weekends. Could be sometimes a combination of things. The key is that frequency of usage, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. So the second key is repetition. So just like when we learn things, any kind of procedural skill, like learning to tie our shoes, or when we learn to ride a bike, when we learn to walk, what we have to do is we have to try it over and over and over again until our brain can put all those processes working together at the same time. So we have to repeat it. We have to rehearse it. We have to do practice. Practice does not make perfect, despite what some people say, but it does make permanent. So when we rehearse something over and over again, we drive it to the level of automaticity. We get it functioning at a level where our brains don't have to think about it. And the term that the neuroscientists often talk about is neurons that fire together, wire together. So when a network of neurons that's used to accomplish these skills is used to firing together, they are activated together, then it's more likely that they will activate together the more practice they get. The third key is progressive challenge. So if you practice something that you already know how to do and you're not challenging yourself, you're not really going to get any better at it. We talk about the zone of proximal development, so we have to be reaching a little bit beyond what we can currently do to be able to expand and improve the skills that we're working on. Sometimes these are called Goldilocks tasks. They're not too hard, they're not too easy, they're just right. Just like the 3 bears porridge when the Goldilocks went to visit them in the forest. So making sure that that gets progressively more challenging and that we're what we can currently do. The fourth is we refer to as smart practice. Practicing is one thing, repeating is one thing, but doing it in a smart way is just as important. And what this means, but that we're going to do it in a way that it's not always predictable. Because when it's predictable, we tend to not engage as much. We're not as focused. We're not as intent on what we're doing because we think we know it's coming. So we always want to change things up a little bit. And we'll look at this some more when we give a concrete example of a program that does meet all of these criteria. The next thing is, and this is the one that is probably of all of the keys that we're going to talk about today, is the most controversial. Because what many in the neuroscience community have been saying, and are saying pretty actively right now, is that you have to develop individual skills discreetly. They put the focus on, I'm going to figure out exactly what that skill is that is not working well, and I'm going to work just on that. And there's a certain intuitive appeal to that because, of course, we want to find the weak link. We want to find the thing that's not working as well. But what our experience has shown us is that if we don't spend more time on those weaker skills, but also work on integrating them with all of our other cognitive processes, we're just not going to get them working the way that we want them to and the way that our brains work. Because we said before, remember, our brains aren't just doing one thing at a time. We have to get those skills all working together. And that's really important. And the real key here, and I think the big story implication of all of this is that if we are doing it in an integrated way, then we're going to have a much better chance of seeing transfer to other kinds of activities, so that the cognitive training will have a much better impact, a stronger impact on reading and math and everything else we do, which is, of course, what we care about. If we weren't going to do that, we wouldn't want to spend as much time on it, probably. The next one has to do with the intensity of training. Here, we know that if we're really working on something, we're really putting the effort into it, we're probably going to get a better result. And one of the things, or one aspect of what we want to be thinking about here is what kind of motivation and engagement can we create? How can we make this both intrinsically motivating and maybe some extrinsic motivation as well, some external rewards and things like that. But we really want to drive as much engagement, because that intensity of training is also going to yield results. And then the last point is has to do with feedback and coaching. And of course, our brains are going to learn faster and better if we get instantaneous feedback on what's working and what's not working. So as we try those repetitions, we want to see if we're getting better. We want to know right away. And the other thing is that a good coach can also help with that. If it's a computer-based program, obviously there's going to be a very instantaneous response. But a coach can also be very helpful in that, in reflecting and helping develop strategies, and also providing support and some of that motivation that we said was so critical. So those last two really pretty much fit together. So what I want to do now is take a quick look at some cognitive training program called Brainware Safari that actually incorporates all of these elements. And the first one I'm going to do is an exercise that, a cognitive training exercise that focuses on visualization and working memory. Remember, we talked about how important those are for reading and comprehension. And show you a little bit about how this works. Now, there are other skills that are also being developed here, but visualization and working memory are really important. So what's going to happen here, this is the very early entry level. So this is the simplest way of doing it. Doesn't usually put too many demands on, it's very basic on working memory and visualization. But here we go. The computer's going to give us 3 cards and turn them up with numbers on them and turn them back over. And so our job, again, this is the play along part, is to get them into numeric order from smallest to largest. So it was a 4 and a 1 and an 8, which I can remember because my working memory is apparently still okay today. Now if I'm going to move the 1 to the beginning, and I think they should be in numeric order now. Let's see. Okay, good. So you can see, of course, sequencing, visualization, visual-spatial. We've got a lot of things going on there. But without visualization and working memory, that's going to be very, very difficult. And how we can start to develop that at a very basic level. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump up a few levels so that you can see how much more challenging it gets and how we introduce some of what I call the unexpected and the novelty that keeps our brains really engaged in what we're doing, and that does inherently also make the task more complex. So that's going to happen this time, very similar. The goal is the same, to get the cards into numeric order, but this time they're going to be 4 cards, but it's not just about more cards. The fact that when the computer turns them back over and we can't see the numbers anymore, it's going to move some cards around on us. And then we're still going to have to follow that and get it into the right order. So here we go. 8, 3, 2, 7. Now this is the computer moving them. Okay, all right, this is work here. I think that the last one is the 2. And I think the one that's now last was the 3. And I think the 7 and the 8 are in the right order. Oh boy, I'm a little nervous here. Okay, phew. Did it. But that's not easy. And of course, we want to work our way up to it. We're not going to jump to something that's so much more difficult that we aren't able to stretch and reach to do it. But by practicing it at more progressively more challenging and introducing that complication of the moving the cards around, we're really going to drive those skills to a much stronger. It wants me to keep practicing. That's why it's giving me that little encouragement there. The other one I want to show you is one that works on directionality, since we singled that one out earlier. And this is one, and we're going to look at the very basic level. You can see at the bottom of the screen the buttons that say right, left, up, and down. And at this level, it's simply about practicing our knowledge of left and right and up and down, and making sure that we have those with enough fluency that we can apply them without consciously working on it all the time. So what we get is 2 rows of arrows, and all we have to do is click on the direction the arrow is pointing, starting with this first one, which is, of course, pointing down, and then right, and then right, and then down. And I do have a time limit here, so I can't just sit and put my hands up and try to figure out what's left and right. I actually have to be able to do it fairly fluently, not in a rush, but fairly fluently. So you get the idea here. But remember that we talked about the fact that directionality is not just knowing left and right. It's also about being able to project that onto other objects and manipulate it. Remember that rotation exercise that we did that's so sort of fundamental in geometry? Well, that's what we have to do here. So instead of clicking on the direction the arrow is pointing at this level, we have to mentally rotate it a 1/4 turn clockwise, so a 1/4 turn to the right, and that's the button that we have to click. So while the first arrow is pointing down, I'm not going to click down. I'm going to use my inhibitory control, and I'm also going to imagine and visualize what it would look like if it was rotated, and it would be pointing left. So I got that right. And on I go, mentally rotating the arrows so that I can name them the way they would be pointing if they were turned. Oops. Right, I blew it on that one. But the point is that when you get to a level where your brain sort of takes over and can do this non-consciously, then you really have those skills at that automatic level that they need to be. Okay, so I'm going to leave this for now, and I'm going to go back. Ooh, you know what? I wonder if you could see that. Were you able to see that? Oh, boy, I blew that one. Okay. That is my fault. That is nothing other than user error. So what I did not do is share my screen, which I apologize for. But what we're going to do is we're going to give you all an opportunity to check out the program yourself. And I'm sorry I didn't. I'm sorry I did that. That was obviously not what I intended to do. I don't want that either. Okay, let me go back to my slides now and do this. So I encourage you to play it for yourself. I will send information. In fact, I might even have a little video of those working that I can send along, so you'll have the benefit of doing that. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about the research and the kinds of changes that using a program that meets these criteria can have on student cognitive development and academic performance. So what I'm going to share with you now, specific learning disabilities. This was part of her doctoral dissertation. And what she did was take students who were in a interventions that they were entitled to, reading and math interventions, but they had not done a cognitive intervention. So she used the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive battery as the pre and the post test. You all may be familiar with that. What she did was turn the scores into something called a relative proficiency index, where 90%, so this upper line here, is the level that is considered to be appropriate of a normally developing student. And you can see that on the cognitive measures, both the control group and the study group were quite a bit below 90. They were performing about 60% proficiency, which makes sense. By definition, we know, because these kids are SLD, that they have deficits in some of those underlying processes. So the protocol was that 3 to 5 times a week for 12 weeks, 30 to 60 minutes per session. And not, of course, the control group did not receive that. And you can see virtually no change for them. The group that used Brainware and did the cognitive training here scored afterwards at 89% proficiency. So virtually closing the gap to what would be considered normally developing. And then you can see also the transfer that we have on reading and on math. The improvement over this time period was 0.8 of a grade equivalent in reading and a full grade equivalent in math. She also then broke the cognitive test down into some of the subtest areas of the Woodcock-Johnson. And here is where we can really sort of tie it back to that pyramid of skills and to some of those critical areas that we were talking about. You can see how low these students were on things like verbal working memory, their short-term memory, their attention skills, really substantially below where we would expect them to be developmentally at their age. So, Tara, that goes back to your question about development, and that sometimes, while these are maturational in some ways, they don't always happen the way that we want them to. And the fact that we're getting them, the good cognitive training approach is getting them very close to, sometimes even at or exceeding a little bit the level that would be considered normally for a normally developing child. So all of this suggests that we really should be looking at 4, not 3 pillars of strategies in special education, and cognitive skills training can really play a role here. And the last thing I want to do before we open up for questions is talk a little bit about considerations for IEPs and incorporation of cognitive skills training. So the areas that we typically want to make sure are addressed in an IEP, things like current level of performance, measurable goals, the specific services that are going to be provided, and then considerations of the ability to participate along as an inclusion or with non-disabled students. So when we're looking at the current level of performance, when we're talking about the cognitive side, and of course we want to be talking about strengths and weaknesses for any child that we're talking about. On the cognitive side, typically when there's an IEP involved, there will have been some kind of cognitive assessment. There are a whole variety of assessments. This is not an exhaustive list here. But the idea is that we want to have some good measure of the level of cognitive development of the student. In addition to that, though, we should be looking at parent and teacher observations, because often that's what leads to the identification of a student with learning disabilities, that there are things that they are doing that are easily observable by parents and teachers that are indicators of cognitive development. So things like the ability to remember a set of instructions, or the ability to copy information accurately from the board, things like that. And those are very easy to, should be pretty easy to come up with as indications of the current level of cognitive development. When it comes to, and of course, schools have plenty of data on current levels of performance academically, probably more testing going on there than anybody really needs. So, goal is going to be. So when we're looking at, on the cognitive side, we're looking at the assessment that was originally administered. Of course, as we saw with Dr. Avson's research, we're not going to expect to see some changes in that. Typically, cognitive assessments are not done more frequently than once a year, but they can be, and sometimes they're only done every couple of years. But the point is, if we're going to expect change, especially over a shorter period of time, then we want to think about using some assessments that will be able to measure that change and to document what we're seeing. And the important thing being is, of course, that they're completely independent, but highly correlated with academics. And of course, then we're going to do the same thing with parent and teacher observations. So some of those things that have been identified as things the student couldn't do or couldn't do as well as we would all like, you know, maybe we're going to say, well, our student's going to accurately follow a 3-step verbal instruction, or maybe only a 2-step verbal instruction, but something beyond obviously their current level of performance. Maybe we want to say Harold will be able to copy homework assignments from the board accurately. So we can also set measurable goals, not just on performance on the cognitive assessment, but also in those areas of easily observable behaviors that are indicative of cognitive development. We also want to think a little bit differently, perhaps, about goals on the academic side. Very often in an IEP situation, goals are incremental. They're about progress. Maybe they're about progress at some rate that is similar to the progress expected for other students in that grade, or maybe it's less than that. But if we think about it in terms of our ultimate goal being getting those students to perform at the level of their better performing peers, on a par with their peers, not just progress, but how are we going to close the gap? And to talk a little bit about that, I'm going to give an example of an experience using cognitive skills training with Brainware Safari in a school district in Pennsylvania. This is a pretty high performing district, overall doing pretty well. And they use a test called GRADE as a formative assessment. It's actually predictive of performance on their state standardized test, which is how they use it and why they use it. And it covers word reading, word meaning, vocabulary, various sentence and passage comprehension, also listening comprehension. So it's a pretty broad test of reading-related skills. And what you can see here is the expected score, the grade level score for 4th graders, the grade level score for 5th graders, and how the students did in both 4th grade and 5th grade. 4th grade was used as the benchmark, and the students did cognitive training in 5th grade and then took the test again. And what you can see here is that the students overall were performing much better than grade level to begin with, and they're performing even higher, to an even greater degree, better than grade level afterwards. But then we started to break the groups down, and as we would typically experience in a classroom, the students who are performing at or above grade level, which is this core group, are experiencing still some nice growth, but of course they're already way above grade level performance standards. The below core are substantially below that, and you can see that they are catching up significantly. I also want to point out this group of IEP students where they were substantially below grade level in 4th grade, now substantially above grade level in 4th grade, and actually closing the gap, certainly closed the gap on performing at grade level norms, but also starting to perform much closer to what their peers, their non-disabled peers are doing. When it comes to identifying the services, I think that there are several things that have to be clear in an IEP, what kind of cognitive training tool that will be used, and making sure that it meets some of those, or all of the key characteristics that we talked about for effective cognitive training. If it's going to be done by a clinician, then making sure that the full spectrum of cognitive skills are being developed. And in any event, whether it's a clinician or whether it's somebody else, which it can be in many instances with a cognitive training tool, who is going to be that coach? Specifying when and where the program will be used. We can't just take it for granted that if we want 3 to 5 times a week, it has to be very specifically planned. It has to be, okay, one session is during technology time, another session is during study hall, and another session is some other time. So getting very specific about that, as well as who will monitor the progress and how, and showing that the training is actually taking place as intended. One of the interesting things with cognitive skills training is that because it can be helpful for everybody, there's no reason that the whole class or the whole group of students or a much larger group of students can't do this all at the same time. It's beneficial for students who are normally developing, for gifted students, really the full range of academic performance and cognitive performance. So it's something that it doesn't have to exclude the student from participating and working with or alongside their peers. Okay, we are bumping up against our stop time, and I don't want to miss the chance to answer a few questions. I'm going to do that. As I do, though, I want to just emphasize that we are going to be providing these resources to you. You will get them via email, and you don't have to do anything other than if we don't have your right email, we would certainly, we'll get those out to you probably within the next 24 hours. And the other thing I want to mention, but I do want to get a couple of questions here, is that if you're interested in Brainware Safari, if you're a parent or someone using it at home in that kind of environment, you can get a discount on your purchase of the program at mybrainware.com. There's a promo code, webinar, just like that, that will give you that 50% discount. If you're an educator or clinician, we are happy to offer you a free evaluation account so you can explore it for yourself. We usually team that with a 30-minute demonstration, which is the most effective use of your time in seeing more of the program and understanding it. So that is that. So let me go back and actually I just asked questions, but while I do that, I'm going to put up my contact information so I make sure it's available to those who are watching today as well as to those who are listening to this as the recording. All right, so I'm going to try and track back now and see if there's some questions. So Cynthia asked about resources or guidance on how to go about requesting cognitive training for her son. That's probably something we can help more with if we understand a little bit. This is going to be new to some school environments, but we can certainly talk through that with you, and perhaps now that I have this, one of us will follow up with you and perhaps talk about some strategies for you. Also talking about Asperger's. So we did research actually a few years ago with a number of children on the autism spectrum. Those who did the best with the program, it's not probably going to be appropriate for all students with autism, but it worked very well for some, particularly those who were higher functioning, those who were 8 years and older. Typically, Brainware can be used down to age 6, but with autism, it seemed to work better for those who were 8 and up. So we have a study that's actually published on our website along with all of our other research, and you can check it out there. Fabrizio asked about the span, the study between the pre and the post test. That was 12 weeks. During those 12 weeks, the control group was just going about their normal routine, school as usual, and the Brainware group was using Brainware 3 to 5 times a week for 30 to 60 minutes for that 12 weeks. I'm scanning back to see if there are other questions. I'm going to go to the end. Please type in any questions you might have. Susan is asking about Betty Garner's From Getting to Got It. I don't know. I'm not as familiar with that, but I'm always interested in seeing what other people are doing and learning about cognitive skills training, and I will definitely follow up with you on that once I figure out a little bit more about it. I'm very interested, so I appreciate your bringing that to my attention. So receptive language, expressive language, and nonverbal problems. One of the real strong areas of Brainware is its ability on the nonverbal areas. Most of it is nonverbal. Most of it is about those underlying skills that don't necessarily need to be put into words. We have not done any research, to my knowledge, on the specific impact on language disorders, although we have seen it be, anecdotally at least, helpful with some children with dyslexia and things like that. I don't really know. I think we could probably talk about that a little bit more, but certainly on nonverbal problem would be very, very helpful. Okay, we're at 5:01, and which is the time we said we would stop, over 1 minute actually, and so certainly invite you to ask any more questions you might have. We really, really appreciate your spending some time with us this afternoon. It's been great to have you here. We hope we've provided some things of interest, and that we'll have an opportunity to continue the conversations with you and how we help our students as time goes on. So again, thank you very much for being here. You will get the materials. You will get a notice when the recording of the webinar is available. And anything else, please feel free to contact any of us, and we will be very, very happy to help you. So I hope you have a wonderful afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, and we'll look forward to talking soon. Take care, everybody.